Dracula, mid-May 1913, somewhere out at sea. A ship called the Demeter, a schooner that was bringing cargo from Romania to England, was caught in a violent storm at sea. The journey of the Demeter had been a cursed one, since it had crossed the Bosporus into the Mediterranean. It had rather a string of bad luck, as its crew members were disappearing one by one. The weather was calm and quiet throughout its journey, but by the time they entered the Celtic Sea, suddenly that violent storm was upon them, and by now there was only a handful of crew members left. The remaining crew members and their captain believed that the earth they were hauling to England was cursed. There was something evil in them. And as the captain had tied himself to the big wheel to steer the ship to safety, he ordered the rest of his crew members to go down below deck and get rid of those boxes. The deck was rather eerily quiet, except for the noise of the rats that were lurking around below deck. The first mate says to the rest of the crew members in Romanian, "Let's grab that first crate over there." So him and the rest of the guys went over to grab the first crate, and as they were grabbing the first crate, suddenly a clawed hand bursts forth from the top of the crate. The clawed hand grabs the first mate by the throat and rips it out. The rest of the crewmen were terrified as they saw the first mate killed, and whatever was inside that crate completely bursted free and killed the rest of the crewmen. Then it made its way above deck into the raging storm. And the captain, who was tied to the big wheel steering the ship, couldn't do nothing as he was tied down. All he could do was look in terror and let out a blood-curdling scream. It was over for the captain. Meanwhile, in London was getting battered by the wild storm. As the storm raged on outside, and one of its docks, the Demeter runs aground with a loud crash. Meanwhile, in Purley, a small town south of London, the storm was raging there too. At the Seward Sanitarium, a privately owned mental hospital owned by Dr. Jack Seward, the storm had all the mental patients riled up, screaming and acting wild. Dr. Seward, a middle-aged man with cloud-white hair and thick matching beard, was running frantically trying to medicate the disturbed mental patients. As he was doing that, he screams at Martin, his head orderly, a tall Caribbean man, and he screams at him, "Martin! Martin! Get more laudanum to soothe their shattered nerves." And then Dr. Seward screams at his nurse, Miss Wells, and he says to her, "Nurse Wells, go upstairs and get my daughter Lucy. Tell her I need her help down here." Nurse Wells screams back, "Yes, Dr. Seward." Meanwhile, in her bedroom, Lucy was there with her adopted sister, Mina. Both women were in their early 20s. Lucy was a beautiful, slim, slender, blonde-haired, blue-eyed woman, while Mina was a beautiful, slim and slender woman with jet black hair and brown eyes. But Mina was a very sickly young woman, as she was very pallid. Lucy was sitting down in her chair reading the note to Mina about Jonathan's promotion to partner. She was very excited. Mina's like, "Oh my goodness, this is wonderful. Pretty soon you two are going to be married." Lucy says with elation in her face, "Yes, yes indeed." Then suddenly the moment was interrupted by a knock on the door, and Nurse Wells was at the door saying to Lucy, "Miss Lucy, your father needs you downstairs. The patients are really riled up." Lucy shouts back, "I'll be down there in a second." She gets up from her chair, puts on her robe, and puts on her slippers, and she says to Mina, "Just go to sleep. You really look terrible today." Mina says, "I'll be fine." Lucy says, "No, please go to sleep, please." Mina says, "Okay," and she gets into bed, and Lucy exits the room. As she turns off the light, the storm that was raging outside was very frightening, as a bright flash of lightning and a loud crackle of thunder had frightened her. She gets up to look out of the window, almost as if she was called by some curiosity. She looks out the window at the raging storm, and she sees what looked like a giant dog, or was it a wolf? She couldn't really tell with the heavy rain outside. The dog or wolf was running around on the property looking like it was lost, but finally it disappeared into the blinding rain. She was partially frightened, was like, "Oh my god, I hope that big dog is not vicious," she said to herself. Meanwhile, through a wooded area, the big dog that Mina saw was actually a wolf. And the wolf was running through the woods and finally running down the old country road. The storm had begun to die down as the heavy rain started to turn into normal rain, finally light rain, and it's finally stopped as the wolf was running down the road. It was still thundering and lightning, but finally the wolf reached Carfax Abbey, an abbey that was just a few miles down the road from Seward Sanitarium. The abbey itself had been abandoned since the dissolution of monasteries in the 16th century, and it had come on the market for sale last year, and it was bought at the beginning of the year by Dracula. The abbey was fixed up by a local construction company and made livable again, but the exterior still needed work as it still looked like it was abandoned. That was going to be a work in itself. Finally, the wolf ran into the courtyard of the old abbey and ran up the stone steps. Then, at the front of the old wooden doorway, the wolf morphed into a man. This man was wearing pants and a heavy fur-lined coat. This man was looking around at his new home, and then he reaches in for his pocket and pulls out an old skeleton key. He unlocks the door and he opens it and enters. Dracula has arrived. The next morning, the newspapers were reporting on the mystery schooner that crashed into the docks in London with the crew cadavers found inside. And it was also reported that the schooner was hauling boxes of dirt from Eastern Europe and that the boxes were intact and they were quickly being delivered to its destination. Well, that morning, Dr. Seward was outside with Martin surveying the property for any storm damage. There were a few knocked down branches and big twigs and all that stuff. Then a car pulls up. It was the car of Jonathan Harker. The young 25-year-old solicitor steps out of his car and he says, "Good morning, Dr. Seward. Good morning, Martin." The two men greet him back. "Good morning, Jonathan." Then he asks Dr. Seward, "Well, what are you doing, Doctor?" Seward says, "I'm just checking the property for any storm damage. So far, nothing major, just minor knocking down of branches and limbs." Then Jonathan says, "Well, you got lucky. You should have seen the damage that the storm did last night out in London." Then he goes on to say, "A schooner named the Demeter crashed in the docks, and this is supposed to be the same ship," he says, "that our client, Dracula, was supposed to be on, but he was not on there. The only thing that was on board was the crates of earth that he said he was going to bring with him and his luggage. And his belongings were quickly carted off to Carfax Abbey this morning, said Jonathan. Then suddenly they were interrupted by a very wild, angry-looking man emerging from the wooded area, and he says, "Jonathan Harker." Then he angrily says to Jonathan Harker, "First you stole Carfax Abbey from under my nose, you bloody silver-tongued bastard, and now you don't tell me that the Count was coming in last night." Jonathan was like, "What? The Count came in last night?" Then Renfield said, "Yes, he came in. He gave me quite a fright, knocked on the door of my cabin, and introduced himself and gave me implicit instructions on what to do. And his first instruction was for me to tell you, Mr. Harker," said Renfield, "that to come over tomorrow night so he could sign all the paperwork to finalize the purchase of Carfax Abbey." Then Dr. Seward said, "Oh, good, and I shall invite him to dinner at the sanitarium." And then Renfield says curtly to Dr. Seward, "Oh no," he said, "he's not to be disturbed for almost the entire week. He's trying to settle in and get some important business out of the way before he, as he put it himself, before he socializes with his neighbors. So don't take it wrong, he told me to tell you, Dr. Seward." Dr. Seward's like, "Oh no, I don't take it wrong, I understand. Moving to a new country and everything, it's kind of jarring. I did some traveling myself in my younger days," says Dr. Seward. Renfield just looked at Dr. Seward, and then he says to everybody, "Right, I'd be off now," and he turns around and walks off. Martin says in his Jamaican accent, "Huh, what a rude man. Ugh." Then Dr. Seward says, "Yes, he is kind of vulgar, I admit, but hey, that's life," he says. Then Jonathan Harker says, "I can't stand that man," he says to Dr. Seward. Then he asked Dr. Seward, "Did you have breakfast yet, Doctor?" Dr. Seward said, "Not yet. As soon as we're done here, we'll sit down to breakfast." Jonathan said, "Oh, good. I am starving." Well, the afternoon was turning to dusk, and Renfield was busy hauling up the giant crates of earth into the abbey. He was dragging one crate up the stairs to the second floor. As Renfield labors away, pulling up that crate up to the second floor, one of the crates that was up there already opens up. A caped figure emerges from the crate and slowly makes his way to the stairwell. He looks at the middle-aged Renfield, who had stopped very briefly to wipe the sweat from his brow. Renfield felt that somebody was up there looking at him, and he turns his head and he sees that figure, and he says angrily, "This is the last one. Bloody lucky for you, I'm not a machine." Then the figure leaps from the top of the stairs and turns into a giant bat and attacks Renfield. The giant bat quickly bit Renfield in the neck. Renfield, panicking, quickly loses his balance and falls down the stairs, hitting his head hard. But it was not the end for Renfield. The giant bat flies out of the old abbey, and it starts its prowl through the countryside. Somewhere in the countryside, on the darkened country road, a young farmer by the name of Swales was on his wagon as he was telling his horse to hurry it up, "I want to get home for supper." As he was being cranky, like probably a lot of the farmers out in that area, suddenly the giant bat dives from above, hitting Swales and knocking him off his wagon. The horses spook and quickly run off in a hurry. Swales was screaming and cussing up a storm when all of a sudden he sees a darkened figure with a cape. That darkened figure quickly grabbed him by the shirt collar and lifted him up like he was nothing. With tremendous strength, the figure puts his hand on Swale's head and forces his head back to expose the neck. Then the figure lunges and bites into Swale's jugular, sucking him dry. Later on, it was near dawn, and Renfield regained consciousness as he was rubbing the back of his head. He had a pain in the back of his head from hitting his head, and a pain in his neck where he was bitten at. He gets up and he wanted to get some water as he had a bizarre thirst, a thirst that he'd never experienced before. He made his way to the kitchen. He tried to look for a cup or a glass, but he couldn't find one. He was getting frantic. All of a sudden, he saw a giant roach walking across the counter. And seized by some unknown desire, Renfield quickly grabbed the roach, put it in his mouth, and began eating it. After he ate the roach, Renfield realized what he did and he said to himself aloud, "Oh my God, what did I just do?" Then he was frightened by Dracula was behind him. And he says, "Oh God, Dracula, I didn't know you were behind me." Then Dracula says, "I saw you had a bad slip and fall, Renfield. Are you okay?" Renfield says, "Yes, I'm okay, Count. I'm okay. I need water," he says. I couldn't find any drinking glasses." Dracula says, "Well, I haven't bought them yet. I just moved in." And then Dracula says to Renfield, "If you feel up to it, I need you to go this morning out to the stores to buy them and several other things. I have Mr. Harker coming over tonight." Renfield says, "Yes, I feel up to the task, sir. I'll be okay." Finally, the sun was setting, and Jonathan Harker arrived. He knocks on the door, but there was no answer. Then he rang the doorbell. There was no answer. He decided to just try it out, and Jonathan reaches for the knob, twists the knob, and the door opens. As he goes inside, he was amazed how fixed up and beautiful the inside of Carfax Abbey was looking. He goes in there and he screams, "Dracula! Dracula!" And he also screams, "Renfield! Renfield!" But there was no answer. So he screams Dracula's name again, and Dracula says, "I'm here," startling Jonathan. Oh, God! Dracula says, "Oh, I'm terribly sorry, Mr. Harker. I didn't mean to give you a fright." Jonathan Harker says, "It's okay, Count, it's okay." And he says, "Where's Renfield at?" Dracula says, "I don't know. The man is useless. I'm on the verge of firing him." Then Dracula says, "Come, Mr. Harker, we'll do the paperwork signing in the dining room." Jonathan says, "Okay." So the two men head to the dining room and sit down at the table. Dracula, of course, sitting at the head of the table. Dracula was wearing a silk green smoking jacket with a matching color ascot. And then he tells Jonathan, "Well, Mr. Harker, let me sign away." Jonathan smiles and pulls out all the paperwork from his briefcase, and he tells Dracula where to sign. Dracula grabs the fountain pen, dips it in the ink, and begins signing away. After he was done, then Jonathan Harker says, "Well, Count, you're the proud owner of Carfax Abbey." Dracula lets out a smile and gets up from the table, and he says to Jonathan, "This calls for a celebration." And then he asks Jonathan, "What would you like to drink? Wine? Brandy? Sherry?" Jonathan says, "Oh no, Count, I can't drink. I'm going right now to London so I can get to the office when it opens up first thing in the morning and submit these paperwork." Then he says to Dracula, "If you excuse me, Count, I must go." Then Dracula says to Jonathan, "Of course, good night and safe journey to you, Mr. Harker." Jonathan says, "Thank you, Dracula, and thank you for doing business with our firm." So Dracula sees Jonathan to the door, and Jonathan leaves and jumps into his car and drives off. Dracula shuts the door, and as Jonathan was driving away from the abbey, as he was going into the more wooded areas of the roadway, suddenly from the back, Renfield attacks him, trying to wring his neck, and just muttering nonsense. Jonathan quickly hits the handbrake, sending Renfield flying forward, causing him to hit his head on the dashboard. Jonathan gets out, and Renfield goes out after him. The two fight, but then Renfield hears a chirping of a bat up in the trees, which freaks him out. Renfield looks upwards and sees the giant bat hanging upside down in the tree. Jonathan sees it too, and Renfield starts screaming in terror as Renfield's screaming, "No, master, no, I wasn't trying to warn him. I wasn't trying to warn him. Don't hurt me!" Moments later, Renfield was now in a straitjacket, being hauled into a padded cell at Seward Sanitarium. He was rambling, saying that the Count was a monster, that he's inhuman, that he was going to kill everybody. Jonathan and Dr. Seward were looking at the whole spectacle, with Dr. Seward saying to Jonathan, "You're lucky, Jonathan. You're lucky he didn't kill you." Jonathan says, "Yes, I know, Doctor. I am thankful that he didn't." Then Lucy runs up to Jonathan, hugging him. It's like, "Oh my God, Jonathan, I heard what happened. Are you alright?" Jonathan says, "Yes, Lucy. I was able to fend him off, but I don't know what's going on with Renfield." Martin says, "Oh, I know what's going on. He finally snapped. I knew this was going to happen one day. I knew." Then Dr. Seward says to Martin, "Martin, give him some laudanum so he can calm down." Martin says, "Yes, Dr. Seward." Then Jonathan says to Lucy and Dr. Seward, "Well, if you excuse me, you two, I have to get to London to get these paperwork filed." Lucy says, "Oh, Jonathan, don't leave so soon. You almost got killed. Why not just stay here tonight, one of the guest rooms, and rest up, and you can go tomorrow morning?" Jonathan says, "No, I have to be there tomorrow morning," he says to her. Anyways, he says, "I'll be back in the afternoon." Then Lucy says, "Okay." Then the two begin to kiss, and Dr. Seward say, okay, you two, save some of that for marriage. Go ahead, Jonathan." Jonathan smiles and says, "I'll see you two tomorrow afternoon," and walks off. Jonathan leaves the sanitarium and gets into his car and drives off. But unbeknownst to him, on the top of the roof of the sanitarium was Dracula watching him leave. As his cape was flapping in the breeze, a fog was rolling in. Then Dracula begins to crawl down the wall of the sanitarium like an insect. He reaches the window of Lucy's room where Mina was in there, laying in bed trying to sleep. As she was trying to sleep, she heard a scratching sound coming from the window. She lifts her head up to see what was at the window, and she sees the figure of a man upside down scratching at the window pane. Well, when the pieces of pane falls off and the hand of the man comes inside and opens the window from inside. As the window opens, Mina, in terror, quickly just hides under the cover. She didn't even bother to scream. Then she slowly pulls the sheet back to see if the man was in the room, or was it just some sort of nightmare brought on from all the medicines that she's been taking for her ill health. But it was no nightmare. He was still there, approaching the bed. She looked into his glowing red eyes, and all of a sudden, her fear and terror was gone. And then she just calmed down and laid back. And Dracula comes up to her and puts the bite on her. After he was finished, he left the room. Well, Lucy comes into the room, and Mina was unconscious. She figured that Mina was asleep. So she lays down and just goes to sleep herself. The next morning, she wakes up and Mina was gasping for air. Lucy looks in horror as Mina was white as the bed sheets and gasping for air, saying, I can't breathe. I can't breathe. Then Lucy gets up and rings the bell, screaming for her father and anybody. Then she runs out to the hall and pounds on her dad's bedroom door. Dr. Seward comes out with his medical bag asking what's wrong, and then Lucy says, "Father, it's Mina. She can't breathe. She's white as the sheets." The two of them run back into Lucy's room, where Dr. Seward sees in horror his adopted daughter reaching out for him, saying that she can't breathe. He tried to attend to her, but he really didn't know what to do. In desperation, he began slapping her across the face. Lucy says, "Father, no, she's fragile." Then Martin comes into the room to see what's going on, since he heard the bell downstairs, and then it was too late. Mina breathed her last as she died. Lucy began to get hysterical and scream at her father and was crying. Dr. Seward ordered Martin to take her downstairs, and Martin says, "Yes, Dr. Seward," and he says, "Come on, Miss Lucy, come on. I know how you're feeling. I was your age when I lost my younger sister. Then, as they walk away, Dr. Seward began to examine Mina, and as he turned her head around, he saw the two puncture marks on her jugular and the discoloration of the skin in that area. Just like all the other victims of this mysterious plague that's been hitting the town, said Dr. Seward to himself in a whisper. And then he gets up and orders the body to be taken down to the sanitarium morgue. The next morning, the funeral was held for Mina. It was a sad and somber funeral. The sky was dark and overcast, with showing signs of rain. The Anglican priest was saying his words as the body was being lowered. Lucy, of course, was crying her eyes out, while her father, Dr. Seward, and Martin were being stoic about it, but you could see the sadness on their faces, and Nurse Wells was also crying her eyes out. After the service, Lucy and her dad, Dr. Seward, were walking away from the cemetery, and Dr. Seward says, "Lucy, I'm afraid I have to go now." Lucy was like, "Father, where are you going?" Dr. Seward says to her, "I have to go pick up Dr. Van Helsing. His ship comes in this morning. I'll be home probably before the evening." Lucy says, "Okay, Father." And she says, "Don't worry, I'll be fine. Anyways, remember, Jonathan should be home early this afternoon." Seward's like, "Yes, he should." "Oh, no," Seward said. "He doesn't know what happened to Mina. Oh, this is terrible." Lucy says, "Don't worry, I'll take care of everything," she says. "Go now, Father." She kisses him and says, "Safe journey to you, Father." Dr. Seward says, "Thank you, my dear daughter," and kisses her on the forehead and walks off. The cemetery was near the sanatorium, and Lucy walks back into the sanatorium and begins to cry by herself in the parlor again. Later that morning, a passenger ship pulls up to the docks in London, and everyone debarks from the ship. Among the passengers was 58-year-old Professor Abraham Van Helsing, a doctor who specializes in rare and obscure diseases. As he was going down the gangplank, he hears a familiar voice screaming towards him, "Dr. Van Helsing! Dr. Van Helsing!" He looks and he sees his old friend Jack Seward. He waves back and walks right up to him, and he says to Dr. Seward, "Ah, Jack Seward, it's been years since I last seen you. My God, you've put on some weight." Seward lets out a chuckle and he says, "Ah, old friend, it seems like you lost more weight." Professor Van Helsing had also cloud white hair and a well-groomed white mustache, and was a very slender-looking man. And then he asks Dr. Seward, "Dr. Seward, please tell me what is going on here. You write to me about a mysterious disease that's ravaging the town you live in and is beginning to ravage the south side of London." Jack Seward says, "Yes, I'll explain more to you over lunch." Well, it was late afternoon at the sanitarium, and Lucy was back out in the cemetery, sitting on a bench near the graveside of Mina. She was still sad. Of course, Jonathan was home already, and he had been filled in on what happened. The sun was going to set soon, so Lucy knew she had to get back inside. As she gets up from the bench, she could hear the distant sound of a horse approaching. Lucy looks, and she sees a man on a giant black horse approaching the cemetery. It was none other than Count Dracula. She sees that he was wearing riding pants, a white shirt, a black cravat, and a long black flowing cape, and the interior lining color was burgundy. He pulls right up to the cemetery gate and pulls the reins for the horse to stop. He noticed Lucy standing at the cemetery gate, and he quickly dismounts the horse, and he introduces himself. "Good evening, I am Count Dracula. I just moved to Carfax Abbey down the road from here. Lucy says, yes, I know, and I heard you've been quite the busy man. Dracula lets out a smile and he says, yes, I've been very busy since I came here. It's been nonstop, but I'm almost concluding my business and I'm ready to just relax, he says to Lucy. Lucy says, well, I'm glad to hear that. And she asks Dracula, what brings you here, Count? Dracula says, I heard the sad news about what happened to your sister. I've come to pay my respects. And he presents a bouquet of white roses. And he says, with your permission, Lucy, I want to place these at your sister's grave. Lucy says, of course, I will show you to her grave. Lucy shows Dracula her sister's grave, and Dracula bends down and puts the bouquet of white roses on top of the grave, and he says, turning and looking to Lucy, once again, Lucy, I'm terribly sorry about your loss. And she says, it's okay. She's in a better place now. She's been sickly all her life and was just suffering, but I'm glad now. I'm glad she's in a better place. Then Dracula says, yes, indeed, she is in a better place. Then the two of them walk away from Mina's grave, and Lucy does what all women always do. She starts asking Dracula questions. She then asks Dracula, so, Count, how old are you? Dracula says, I'm 31 years old. Then she asks Dracula, so, what brings you here to England? Dracula says, well, I always wanted to travel the world. I've traveled some, but I wanted to move to England. I heard this is a very nice country, and that's why I purchased Carfax Abbey, he says. Then Lucy asks the final question, so Dracula, are you married? Dracula lets out a smile and says, no, I'm a widower. My wife died almost 6 years ago. It was, hard, but I moved on. Lucy says, and I'm sorry for your loss, Count. Then Dracula says, it's okay. Life is short. We have to make do what we got and enjoy the very few moments that we have. She smiles in agreement. She says, you're right, Count. It's true. And then she says to Dracula, well, I have to go back now. I live at the sanitarium. And then Dracula says, I know. Jonathan told me everything about you. She lets out a smile. Really? Dracula says, yes. And then Lucy says, well, tomorrow night, Count, if you're not busy, we're having a dinner party for our guest, Dr. Abraham Van Helsing. He's coming here to investigate this mysterious disease that's afflicting this town, and he's staying at the sanitarium. Then Dracula says, of course I will be at the dinner party, he says. He asks Lucy, what time is the dinner party? She says the dinner party is at 8 o'clock. Dracula says, I will be there then. I look forward to seeing you again and seeing Jonathan again and meeting your father and Professor Van Helsing. Lucy smiles and says, okay then, Dracula, 8 o'clock sharp, and she walks away. Meanwhile, in the house, Dr. Seward comes in with Professor Van Helsing, and he screams for Lucy, and Jonathan comes up to him and he says, Dr. Seward, I'm glad you're back. And Dr. Seward says to Jonathan, Jonathan, you're back yourself. And then he says to Jonathan, Jonathan Harker, I want you to meet Professor Abraham Van Helsing from the Netherlands. Then Jonathan shakes his hands and says, it's a pleasure to meet you, Professor Van Helsing. I've heard a lot about you. And Professor Van Helsing, it's a pleasure to meet you too, young man. Dr. Seward has told me everything about you and his lovely daughter. Well, Jonathan smiles and he says to Dr. Seward, I think Lucy went out to the cemetery again to sit by the graveside of Mina. And after Jonathan said that, Lucy comes in and she says, oh, Father, you're home. I am glad. And she hugs her father. And then, of course, Dr. Seward introduced her to Professor Van Helsing. And she says, it's a pleasure to meet you, Professor Van Helsing. Professor Van Helsing says, it's a pleasure to meet you too, Lucy. Then Lucy says to Dr. Seward and Jonathan, oh, you won't believe who I met. I met Dracula. He's out in the graveyard now paying respects to Mina. Jonathan's like, oh, that's good. And Dr. Seward's like, oh, wow. And then she says, oh, Father, I did invite Dracula over to the dinner party tomorrow night, and he said he will be here. Dr. Seward's like, oh, that's wonderful. I finally get to meet our new neighbor. Then Lucy had noticed the look on Professor Van Helsing's face, and she asked Professor Van Helsing, are you okay? Then Professor Van Helsing says, oh, I'm okay. Yes, I am okay. That name, Dracula, rings a bell. Maybe I met this man before, maybe I've heard of the family. You said he's a count? Lucy says, yes, he bought Carfax Abbey down the road here. He is a count. He's from, I think, Romania? And Jonathan says, yes, he's from Romania. He bought the property back in January, had it fixed up, and moved out here last week. And then Professor Van Helsing says, well, I look forward to meeting this Dracula tomorrow night at the dinner party. Then Martin walks up to Dr. Seward and says, ah, good, Dr. Seward, you're back, he said in his Jamaican accent. Then he begins to give a quick report to Dr. Seward about the activities of the sanitarium. As he was doing that, Professor Van Helsing walks up to the back window, and the back window faced out to the nearby graveyard, and he sees Dracula mounted on his black horse right next to Lucy's grave, and he sees that the horse was scared of Lucy's gravesite. Dracula calms the horse and turns the horse around and rides off. Later in Dr. Seward's office, Dr. Seward and Professor Van Helsing enter the office, and inside the office was waiting Dr. Butterworth, the town doctor, and Dr. Seward introduces Professor Van Helsing to him, and he says, Professor Abraham Van Helsing, I want you to meet Dr. Emil Butterworth, the town doctor. The two of them shook hands and said hello to each other. Dr. Butterworth was a man in his mid-30s, and he says to Abraham Van Helsing, it's a pleasure to meet you, Professor. Dr. Seward has told me so much about you, and I've heard so much about you. Your reputation spreads far and wide. Van Helsing says, why, thank you, young man. And I hear, says Van Helsing, that you have a certain problem with an outbreak of a mysterious disease that's got you puzzled and many other doctors puzzled. Dr. Butterworth says, yes, Professor Van Helsing, and I am thankful that Dr. Seward sent for you. And then Dr. Butterworth goes on to explain the symptoms of the disease, and he says to Dr. Van Helsing, and that's it, Dr. Van Helsing, it's very perplexing. Then Van Helsing says, yes, I see. So this disease strikes all of a sudden without warning, and the latest victim was your adopted daughter, Jack. Dr. Seward says, yes, it came on all of a sudden. She was perfectly fine and normal the day before, and then she woke up in the morning with just gasping for air. She couldn't breathe. I had discovered the puncture mark with the skin discoloration by her jugular vein. That is the one telltale sign of this disease. I theorize, says Dr. Seward, that it's some sort of wild animal that came during the storm last week. Van Helsing said, what storm? Then Dr. Seward explains his theory, and he says, last Friday, a violent storm came in from the sea. It did some destruction out in the port area of London. A ship called the Demeanor, a schooner, had crashed into the docks. Then Dr. Seward keeps on explaining, and since that night, that's when it started. The first victim was seen on Saturday. His name was Swales, a young farmer. He was found on the roadside dead with the puncture marks in his neck and very little blood in his body. Then the others kept on proceeding, and another victim of this bizarre disease, says Seward, is Renfield, the former caretaker of Carfax Abbey. Something bit him on the neck, the same puncture marks in the neck and the same discoloration, but instead of killing him, it drove him mad. Sometimes this disease strikes without warning, as Dr. Butterworth says, or sometimes people die maybe the next day. They just slowly waste away. Whatever it is, Dr. Seward said, it had to come in with the storm. Either it was blown in or it was on board the Demeter when it crashed. Then Van Helsing asked Dr. Seward, "Please, Jack, tell me more about the Demeter, what you know or what you heard about it." Then Dr. Seward says, "Well, what I know was from the newspaper," he says to the old professor. Then he goes on to explain, the Demeter is a Greek schooner. It was carrying some cargo from Romania, namely for our new neighbor Dracula, some crates of earth from his country, and his luggage, since Dracula was moving over here. But Dracula was not on board ship. He came ahead, he said, on another ship. But my guess, says Seward, is that the Demeter probably had some wild animal aboard that is native to one of those countries, and then when it crashed, it jumped out and now it's loose. Then Van Helsing asks Dr. Seward, "And what is the crew of the Demeter?" And Seward says, "Well, that's easy, Doctor. They're all dead. They all were killed by wild animals, so see, my theory is starting to show some strength," he says. And then Professor Van Helsing asked Dr. Seward, "And what if this man that used to be the former caretaker of the abbey that Dracula now occupies?" Dr. Seward says, "Ah, yes, Milo Renfield. He was the caretaker for Carfax Abbey for years until the company that owned it decided to sell it. Then after Dracula bought it, he moved in last week and he decided to keep Renfield on as the caretaker. But then Renfield went stark raving mad and attacked Jonathan Harker, my daughter's fiance, on Sunday night. Well, Jonathan was able to fend him off, and we got him in here. That's when I noticed the puncture mark in his neck and the discoloration around it. Then afterwards, for the whole week, says Dr. Seward, he has had a craving for insects." Dr. Butterworth and Professor Van Helsing were like, "What?" "Yes," says Dr. Seward. "He only eats insects, roaches, flies, ants, spiders. He will not touch normal food, despite our best attempts," said Dr. Seward. Then they heard laughter coming from the doorway. Dr. Seward screams, "Come out, whoever you are." And from the doorway emerges Renfield. And then he says, "My, this is funny. Men of science perplexed by a disease they don't know." Then Seward screams, "Okay, Renfield, how did you get out of your cell?" Renfield says, "Oh, that's not important, Doctor. That's not important at all. I just ask you for one thing, Doctor. Relocate me. Send me to another mental institution far away from here. I'm not safe here. No one's safe here, Doctor, because he's out there, and he knows everything. He will not rest until he is glutted." Then Professor Van Helsing asks, "Who, Renfield? Who? Who is your master?" Then Renfield says, "Oh, I don't know who I'm talking about. Don't listen to me. You think I'm all crazy. Why? Because I like to eat insects. Well, guess what? I may be not crazy. Maybe I am crazy. Maybe I'm not crazy. But I'm going to say for one thing, please, Dr. Seward, send me away from here," pleaded Renfield. Dr. Seward says to Renfield, "Well, we'll talk about this later." Then he goes over and picks up his phone to call Martin to come and take him back to his cell. While he was doing that, Professor Van Helsing says to Renfield, Mr. Renfield, I would like to conduct a little test on you to test the theory that I have." Renfield's like, "What test, Professor Van Helsing? What test?" Professor Van Helsing says, "Well, you're about to see." Then Professor Van Helsing reaches in for his interior coat pocket and pulls out a little case. Then he pulls out a little blue flower, and Renfield reacts violently to it, frightening both Seward and Dr. Butterworth. Renfield screams out, "Oh, God! Ah, no! Oh, get that damn weed away from me!" At that moment, Martin enters the office and he says, "Oh, I'm terribly sorry, Dr. Seward. This man's been giving us so much trouble. Now he escaped from his cell, and I don't know how he did it. And I caught him earlier today using his sugar to try to lure flies. So I took it away, sir," said Martin. Then Dr. Seward says, "Okay, Martin, take him back to his cell, put him in the straitjacket for a few hours, and revoke his sugar privileges." Martin says, "Yes, Dr. Seward," and he takes away Renfield, and he says to Renfield, he was taking him out of the office, "I can't believe it, man. We give you good food here, good food, and you don't eat it. You rather eat flies and roaches. What is wrong with you?" As they were exiting the office. Then Dr. Seward turns to Van Helsing and asks him, "Professor, what was that you showed Renfield, and why did he react so violently to it?" Dr. Butterworth said, "Yes, I want to know too." Then Professor Van Helsing says, "Well, gentlemen, this flower here is an herb. It is called wolfsbane. It grows widely in Central and Eastern Europe, and the locals use it to ward off evil spirits along with the garlic flower." After explaining it, Dr. Van Helsing puts the little herb in the little case and puts the case back into the interior pocket of his business suit coat. And Dr. Butterworth said, "I've never seen a man react like that before to such a little herb." Then Van Helsing says to Dr. Butterworth, "That proves it, gentlemen. This proves my theory." Dr. Seward asks, "What theory, Professor?" Then Van Helsing answers back, "My theory of this outbreak, of this disease, it is caused by the vampire." Then Dr. Butterworth says, "Vampire? That is preposterous. This is 1913, not 1513, Professor," said Dr. Butterworth. Dr. Seward weighs in, "Professor Van Helsing, what you're saying is preposterous and just outlandish," he says to the old professor. "Besides, science has proven that those creatures do not exist." Then Professor Van Helsing says, "I am going to prove to you, gentlemen, that the superstitions of yesterday are the undisputed science facts of tomorrow." "I know it sounds preposterous," said the old professor. Then he goes on, "But I had an encounter with one back in 1891. It's a long story, but that was proof to me that they were a vampire. And plus, my dear uncle, Lucas von Gosling, hunted vampires in the 1880s. In 1885, he destroyed a very powerful vampire, and by the decade's end, he had destroyed that vampire's dark disciples." And Van Helsing goes on, "And after I had my encounter with a vampire, then I told him he was the only one I could turn to, and he believed me, and he showed me his notes and everything on it. And after he died 10 years ago, I became caretaker of his notes, and I did research myself adding to it, and I thought the vampire was all but extinct, but now it seems that they're still around. Maybe they're not extinct, maybe the numbers are low," said Van Helsing. Then Dr. Seward's like, "Oh dear God, I can't believe what I'm hearing." "Professor Van Helsing," said Dr. Seward, "you are the most respected man in the world of medicine in all of Europe. And listen to yourself, Professor. Listen to yourself. You sound like one of my patients in here." Then Professor Van Helsing says to Seward and Dr. Butterworth, "Trust me, gentlemen, trust me. I will prove to you that the vampire is real, and you will be thanking me for saving your lives and the lives of the people in this town." The next night, Dr. Seward had a giant dinner party to welcome Professor Van Helsing to England. A lot of people were there, mainly Dr. Seward, who was throwing the party, of course, his daughter Lucy, Jonathan Harker, Dr. Butterworth, and his wife, and another yet unnamed doctor and his wife were there. Oh, it was just any typical dinner party. There was a lot of talking, laughing, and just enjoying the night and waiting for the food to be ready. Well, Lucy decided that she wanted to dance, and she told Jonathan, "Jonathan, I want to dance." Jonathan says, "No, Lucy, no, I don't want to dance." Then Lucy says to Jonathan, "Yes, we're going to dance." She goes over to the phonograph and puts on a record. She says to Jonathan, modern dance music from the Americas, and she pulls Jonathan right out of his chair and forces him to dance with her. The dancing was short lived as they were interrupted by the arrival of another guest. Martin, who was also doubling as a doorman that night, comes into the parlor and announces the arrival of a very anticipated guest as he says, Count Dracula. Then he steps out of the way and Dracula comes in through the door. He was wearing his long burgundy lined black cape and he takes it off and gives it to Martin. And Dracula was wearing a rather unusual looking dinner suit. It was definitely custom made, even though it's very common in that time period to have your suits tailor made, but it was an unusual design, probably to the specification of the Count himself. Dracula says, "Good evening, everybody." Jonathan and Lucy quickly greet him, and it was all nice and warm. Then Dr. Seward comes up to him, and he says, "Ah, Count Dracula, it's finally a pleasure to meet you. I've heard all about you." Then Dracula says, "Ah, Dr. Seward, it's an honor to meet you finally, and I've heard everything about you." Then Dr. Seward introduces Dracula to Dr. Butterworth and his wife, Allison, and to Dr. Westenra and his wife, Dorothy, and everyone shook hands and was cordial. Then Dr. Seward says to Dracula, "Dracula, I would like you to meet the guest of honor tonight of this dinner party." And he says to Dracula, "Dracula, I would like you to meet Professor Abraham Van Helsing of the Netherlands." Dracula says to Van Helsing as he was shaking his hands, "Ah, yes, Professor Van Helsing. I heard a lot about you. You're well known all over the continent," he says to the old professor. And Professor Van Helsing says, "Ah, yes, Dracula, I understand. And I heard a lot about you, too," he says. "I heard that you descended from a very powerful and great family." Dracula lets out a smile and says, Thank you, Professor, but that's ancient history, a very boring subject to a lot of people." Then they all sat down to the dinner table and ate stewed beef. As the dinner was going on, someone offered Dracula a drink, and Dracula says, "Oh, I'm sorry, I do not drink. I'm what you British would call a teetotaler." Everyone at the table smiled and laughed, and they understood. And during the course of the party, while Martin was cutting some strips of beef, he accidentally cut his thumb. As he was sucking the blood that was coming out of his thumb, Dracula was giving him a look that Martin noticed, and Martin says to Dracula, "It's okay, Count. It's nothing major at all. It'll be patched up right away." Everybody had noticed the look that Dracula gave Martin, and Dracula says, "Oh, I am terribly sorry. I'm a bit squeamish, as you say, and all. The sight of blood kind of makes me sick." Dr. Seward says to Dracula, "It's okay, it's a very common ailment." Then Dr. Seward goes on to say, "Oh, my dear late brother Alistair was squeamish too. The sight of blood would make him pass out." Then Lucy says to her father, "Father, you never told me that Uncle Alistair had that problem." Dr. Seward says to Lucy, "Yes, I never told because he didn't want people to know. He found it quite embarrassing." After the dinner part of the party was over, then Lucy says, "Come, let's dance, Dracula." Dracula's like, "I don't want to dance." Lucy says, "Nonsense. You're the second guest of honor tonight, and I want to dance," she says. Then she goes over to the phonograph and puts in another record. Then she goes up to Dracula, and Dracula says to her, "I don't," and then she says, "Oh, don't worry, Dracula, I'll teach you how to dance." Dracula says, "It's not that. I barely know you, madam." Then she says to Dracula, "It's okay. I will lead." And then the two began to dance to the waltz that she put on, making Jonathan very jealous. Later on that night, in a small neighborhood near the center of the town, the night air is pierced with the scream of a woman that emanated from one of the houses in that neighborhood. As she was running after a figure that was running down the darkened hall of her house, she was screaming at it, saying, "It killed my baby! It killed my baby!" The figure she was chasing quickly crashes through the glass of the window, jumping down to the yard and escaping. As she was about to blindly do the same herself, going after this figure, her husband stops her dead on her tracks, saying, "Don't do it! Don't! What's going on?" Then she showed her husband what happened. The husband goes into the child's room and sees his infant son dead with giant puncture marks in his neck. Well, the police came and the incident made the front page of the morning newspaper. And soon as the days were going by, there were more and more reports of children being attacked at night by a lady in white. Those who survived their attack call her the beautiful lady, or the bloofer lady, as some of the younger victims had trouble pronouncing beautiful. And they all have described the same thing. She comes into their homes at night, into their bedrooms, and offers them candy. And those who take up her offer, she attacks. Sometimes she'll attack them if they refuse her offer of candy. 1 week after the attacks had begun, it was just a typical morning at the sanitarium house. Dr. Seward was sitting down to breakfast, along with his dear friend Professor Van Helsing. As they were eating their eggs and figs, then Lucy joins in, and Dr. Seward noticed that his daughter was awfully pallid and she just did not look well. And she had a ribbon around her neck. And he asks his daughter, Lucy, what's going on? Then Lucy says, "Nothing, Father, nothing. I just feel a bit weak today. I don't know why. I had a nightmare. Maybe something that's going around." Then Professor Van Helsing asks, "Lucy, what is this nightmare of yours that you had?" Then she goes to tell the two men her nightmare, that she was sound asleep and a dark figure came in her bedroom and seduced her and bit her in the neck, and then she woke up with neck pains and weak. Then Dr. Seward stops eating. He gets up and goes over to his daughter. He undoes the ribbon of her neck, and when he takes it off, he sees to his horror the two puncture marks in his neck. He balls his fist in anger, and he's like, "Damn, damn, damn! No!" he says. Professor Van Helsing calms Dr. Seward. Jack, calm down. You need to keep a cool head about this." Then Van Helsing says, that does it. I am going to town. I have to get some important supplies for tonight." Then he says to Dr. Van Helsing, "Jack, I will need your help tonight with an important task. I am going to track down the bloofer lady. I have my theories on who she is, and this will be proof positive to you, Jack, old friend, that the vampire is real." At that moment, Jonathan Harker enters the dining room. He always had dinner with them before he ran off to the office in the morning. Then he saw the commotion, and Dr. Seward explained to him what was going on. And he's like, "Is there anything I could do, Dr. Seward?" Dr. Seward says to Jonathan, "No, there's nothing you can do." Later on, the sun had just set, and Jack Seward was with Professor Van Helsing. They were at the gates of the cemetery, and Professor Van Helsing had a beautiful mare, all white, young, and he says to Dr. Seward, "Jack, this horse will find the grave of the vampire." And then he lets the horse run around the cemetery as the mist was building up. And the horse, of course, was very nervous enough where it spotted the grave of the vampire and kicked over the headstone. Professor Van Helsing quickly went and grabbed the horse and brought her back outside the gate and gave her to an attendant that was waiting there for her. And then they go over to the toppled headstone, and it was the headstone of Mina. Then Professor Van Helsing says to Jack, "Come, Jack, old friend, it is time to dig up this vampire." Well, as they were digging up the grave, Dr. Seward says to Van Helsing, "I must protest this, Dr. Van Helsing. I have dealt with enough grief as it is. Now I'm digging up my adopted daughter's grave under these idiotic pretenses that she is this vampire that's been going around attacking children." Finally, they hit the coffin. Professor Van Helsing quickly clears away the dirt and he opens the coffin slowly. And to Dr. Seward's horror, the coffin was empty. Dr. Seward asked Professor Van Helsing, "What the bloody hell's going on here? Where's her body?" Professor Van Helsing examined the interior of the coffin, and he found a hole in the side of the coffin. He lifts up the white taffeta covering to reveal this giant hole in a breeze that was coming through there. And Dr. Seward says, "My God, it's the old mines." Professor Van Helsing looks at Dr. Seward and asks him, "What old mines?" Then Dr. Seward tells the old professor, "There was a mining operation going on here from the middle of the 18th century to the middle of last century. When the mines ran dry, the operation ceased." But he says to the old professor, "There are miles and miles of mining tunnels underneath this town, and this is how she's probably getting around." Then Professor Van Helsing grabs the lantern and slides into the hole in the coffin under Dr. Seward's protests as he was screaming at him, Don't, Professor, don't go down there." Then Professor Van Helsing was in the old mining tunnels exploring it. Van Helsing was walking around, looking quietly, carefully. Of course, he was scared. It was dark under there, and the only source of light was his lantern, and he did not know what was down there. And the question was, where was this female vampire at? He was suddenly startled by Dr. Seward, who comes up to him and he says, "You forgot your bag, Professor." Professor Van Helsing says, "Ah, Jack, you scared me." And then he says to Dr. Seward, "Well, thank you," he says. And then he grabs the bag from Seward, puts it down, opens it up, and he pulls out a giant crucifix. And he was going to pull out the stake, but he says to Dr. Seward, "This is not big enough. If she is down here, she's going to attack. I need a bigger object to stab her with." Then he looks around, and he sees a metal rod leaning against the wall. He quickly grabs it, and he says to Dr. Seward, "Come, Jack, let's find her." Well, as the men were creeping around, Dr. Seward was now holding the lantern while Professor Van Helsing had the crucifix and the long, sharp rod. As they were walking, Professor Van Helsing trips over something and falls forward, landing on both of his knees. In the process, he drops the rod, and the giant crucifix he had falls into a puddle. Dr. Seward quickly puts the lantern on a hook on a metal pillar in the mine, and he kneels down to help Professor Van Helsing up, but Professor Van Helsing says angrily, "No, I lost the cross into this puddle." He sticks his hands into the puddle looking for the crucifix, but as he was looking for the crucifix in the puddle, both men see a reflection in the water. They look up, and they see in horror it was the vampirized Lucy. The vampirized Lucy was there looking at them with burning red eyes. Her skin was a purplish blue color, her ears pointed, and she smiled, revealing her giant ivory white fangs, and she says to Dr. Seward, "Come, father, give your daughter a kiss. I'm scared you buried me by accident. I was not dead. Why?" Dr. Seward was like, I didn't mean to bury you by accident. You were dead. You had no pulse." As she was getting closer to Dr. Seward, suddenly a cross was in front of her face, being held by Van Helsing, who found it in the puddle, and he starts screaming prayers in Latin, telling her to get back. As she was moving backwards away from the cross, she lets out a demonic growl. And then she let out a projectile vomit of blood. The bloody vomit got all over Van Helsing's face, but he was unfazed as he wiped that gross crap off his eyes and face. And he kept on holding her back with the crucifix and the Latin prayers. Then at that moment, fueled by an adrenaline rush, Dr. Seward comes running with the metal rod and runs it right through her, pinning her against the mine wall. After it was over, Professor Van Helsing turns to look at Dr. Seward, and he sees Dr. Seward crying as his vampirized daughter lets out a final word before she dies. She says, "Father." As he sees his friend crying, he comes up to him and he says, Jack, listen to me. That is not your daughter. That is a demonic being, a young woman corrupted by a great evil. We we must finish the job. Jack, he says, you did the hardest thing a father ever had to do. You took down one of your own children. Come, Jack, he says, we must stop the fountainhead of this obscene disease, because if we don't, then there will be others just like her. Come, Jack, we must get out of these mines. Well, when that was going on in the mines, at the sanitarium in Lucy's room, she was there laying in bed waiting for him to come. Soon the giant windows open in her bedroom and a fog rolls in. The fog comes around and takes on the image of a man. It was Dracula, wearing his long black burgundy lined cape, black riding pants, black boots, and his white dress shirt. He says to Lucy, "Come." And she gets up from the bed and runs towards him and embraces him passionately. And the two of them begin to kiss. And then they have sex. After it was over, Dracula then asks Lucy, "Lucy, I will give you a choice I don't give very many women. You're the most beautiful woman in the world, and I want you to be mine. Now," he says to her, "will you take me as your master?" Then she says to Dracula, "Yes, I will. Make me a vampire," she says. Then Dracula says, "Oh, I will make you a vampire, right, but you shall be a very powerful one," he says to her. Then he rolls up the sleeve of his dress shirt, and with his long nails, he cuts the wrist of his right arm, and he says to Lucy, drink of this blood, let it be your life. Flesh of my flesh, blood of my blood. When I give you command, you shall cross sea and mountain to come to me." Then she begins to drink the blood from his wrist. Afterwards, she lays back, and then Dracula disappears into mist again and leaves the room. Jonathan Harker had just come over to check on his fiancée. He had a late day in the office and left it late. And he makes his way to her bedroom. He knocks on the door of the bedroom, but there was no answer. Worried, he opens the door and barges right in, and he sees in horror that Lucy was laying in bed, really sick, gasping for air almost. He then quickly turns around and runs out of the bedroom, running down the hall screaming for Dr. Seward. Well, Dr. Seward and Professor Van Helsing had just come back home. Both men were tired and very dirty from being in the mines. Then Jonathan Harker runs down the stairs and he runs up to Dr. Seward and he says, "Dr. Seward, it's Lucy. She's really sick." Then, with newfound energy, both Seward and Van Helsing run up the stairs. And then they see Lucy in her bedroom, and Professor Van Helsing says, "My God, we are too late." Dr. Seward says, "Oh, no, we're not." And then he runs out of her bedroom, and then moments later comes back with his medical bag. He pulls out a blood transfusion device, and he asks Jonathan Harker, "Did you eat today, Jonathan?" Jonathan Harker says, "Yes, I did, doctor." Then he says to Jonathan, "Roll up your sleeve and sit down here," as he pulls one of the chairs from the side of the room right next to Lucy's bed. Then he does the process of tying a tourniquet to both of them and sticking the needle in their arms, and he begins to manually pump the blood from Jonathan into Lucy's body. As Dr. Seward was doing the blood transfusion, then Professor Van Helsing comes into Lucy's bedroom with Martin. He had cloves and cloves of garlic, and he was telling Martin to rub the garlic balls on the windowsills here and here in the room, and all. And then Jonathan Harker's like, "Oh, Professor, please, do you have to bring those noxious plants here? It's turning my stomach." Dr. Seward looks at Jonathan's like, "Are you having a reaction? Is it from the blood transfusion?" Then Jonathan says, "No, doctor, it's those stupid garlic flowers. Oh my God, they smell so horrible." Then Professor Van Helsing says to Jonathan, "That is the beautiful smell of antiseptic garlic. This will protect your fiancé from that fiend. He has been here tonight, definitely." Later, Professor Van Helsing goes down to the parlor. He walks over to the fireplace where on the mantel there was a bottle of brandy and some drinking glasses. And on the fireplace was a giant mirror that had the reflection of the entire parlor. Van Helsing grabs the glass, grabs the bottle of brandy, opens it, and pours himself some brandy and puts the bottle back on the tray on the mantel. As he was sipping some brandy, looking at the mirror, he sees in the mirror that the French doors opened up and closed, but nobody had walked through it. Van Helsing quickly turns around and sees it was Dracula. Dracula had noticed that Van Helsing looked like he was startled, and he says, "Oh, forgive me, Van Helsing. I didn't mean to startle you, Professor. I'm told I have a light footstep." Then Van Helsing says to Dracula, "Oh, no, no, no. You didn't startle me at all. In fact, I am quite curious," says Van Helsing. "I am curious to why this mirror here that reflects the entire parlor didn't pick up your reflection." Dracula looks at the mirror, and he quickly grabs an ashtray and flings it at the mirror, breaking it. Then Dracula angrily says, "Foul plaything of men's vanity, I hate them." Professor Van Helsing looks in shock, and then Dracula, noticing that, says, "Oh, I'm terribly sorry, Professor. I despise mirrors." Then Professor Van Helsing says to Dracula, "I can see why. You do not cast a reflection. I should have known, Dracula, that it was you, the obscene fountainhead of this cult of vampirism. But tell me, Dracula," said Van Helsing, how did you come back? I thought my uncle killed you a long time ago." Then Dracula says, "Well, Van Helsing, what your idiot uncle didn't realize is that I could easily come back. In the last 28 years, I have died and been resurrected, some by faithful servants, some by men who wished to pay tribute to me, and some by accident." Then Dracula says to Van Helsing, "Now, Van Helsing, I'm going to give you a choice that I don't give many people. Go back to your country and forget what you saw here." Van Helsing says to Dracula, "No, Dracula, no. I will protect those who you wish to harm." Then Dracula says, "Listen to me, old man. I was commanding armies before you were born. You think you can go up against me, the king of vampires, and survive?" Van Helsing says, "Yes, I can. I am not afraid of you, Dracula. I am not afraid of anything. I am a man of courage. I am a man of faith. Dracula, I will not stop until you are once again dead." Dracula lets out a loud chuckle. And he says to Van Helsing, "Van Helsing, you're funny. Stupid, but funny." Then Dracula says to Van Helsing, "Come here, old man." Van Helsing was not listening to him, but then Dracula outstretches his hands and puts Van Helsing under some sort of hypnotic trance, and then he says with a more stern voice, "Come here now." Van Helsing couldn't help it. He was starting to move towards Dracula. He was fighting his movements, but he couldn't. He was completely under the thrall of Dracula. With what little free willpower he had, Van Helsing reached in for his pants pocket and then pulled out a small cross and flashed it in front of Dracula's face. Dracula let out a loud hiss. And he says to Van Helsing, "Put that away." But as Dracula was being repulsed by the cross, his hold over Van Helsing had quickly vanished, and Van Helsing composed himself and moved towards Dracula with the cross. Dracula, using his cape to shield himself from the cross, says, "Van Helsing, I'm going to kill you, and you're going to die a very horrible death." Van Helsing says to Dracula, "No, Dracula, no. Now be gone, foul spawn of Satan, be gone." Dracula screams, "Sacrilege! Sacrilege!" And Dracula runs right to the French doors, and he jumps right through the windows of the French doors. As Dracula landed on the outside, he quickly turns into a big wolf and runs off. Of course, Jonathan and Dr. Seward run downstairs to see what's going on, and Professor Van Helsing explains to them, Dracula was here. Dr. Seward's like, Where? Where is he? Then Professor Van Helsing says, He tried to kill me. He is the vampire. And Professor Van Helsing explains everything to Dr. Seward and Jonathan Harker. Of course, they had trouble believing him, but Dr. Seward was more open to the idea, and he asked Professor Van Helsing, What are we going to do? Then Professor Van Helsing says to Dr. Seward, First thing is first, Jock. First, we must make a believer out of your future son-in-law, and then afterwards I am going to Carfax Abbey, and I am going to take him down once and for all. The next morning, out in the cemetery, the now lifeless body of Mina was laying in a giant funeral pyre. Dr. Seward, Professor Van Helsing, and Jonathan Harker walk up to it. Professor Van Helsing produces a mirror, and he tells Jonathan, Now look, boy, look. And he holds the mirror over the body of Mina, but he tilts the mirror enough so Jonathan could see the reflection. And Jonathan was surprised, says, Professor, there's no reflection. Professor Van Helsing then says to Jonathan, Yes, this proves that she's a vampire. Then Professor Van Helsing hands the mirror back to Dr. Seward. Then the old professor grabs his medical bag and opens it up and produces a Roman ritual book, a flask of holy water, communion wafers, and then he begins saying prayers in Latin, and he puts the communion wafers in the mouth of Mina, and then after he was done, he instructs the groundskeepers of the property to pour oil on the funeral pyre and all over Mina's body, and then they light the funeral pyre, and the three men watched as her body burns up in the funeral pyre. And Van Helsing says to Dr. Seward, Look, Jack, look on the fire. Your adopted daughter has been purified, and now she rests with the Lord. Of course, watching from her bedroom was Lucy, as she was seeing her adopted sister's body being cremated in a massive funeral pyre. Then she turns to Nurse Wells, who was in the room babysitting her, saying, Nurse Wells, can you do me a favor? I'm thirsty and I would like some tea to calm my nerves. And she says to Nurse Wells, Can you please go downstairs and make me some tea and bring it up? Nurse Wells says to Lucy, Of course, madam, but I don't know how your father expects me to keep you in bed. I'll be back in a few minutes, she says. She closes her book that she was reading, gets up from the chair, and leaves the bedroom. As Nurse Wells leaves the bedroom, then Lucy uses the opportunity to run to the closet, get dressed, and then she sneaks out of her bedroom. The three men come back into the house, and Dr. Seward sees Nurse Wells with the tray and the teapot and a teacup, and he asks, Nurse Wells, where are you going? Then Nurse Wells says to Dr. Seward, Oh, it's Miss Lucy. She requested some tea to calm her nerves. Then Dr. Seward runs upstairs to Lucy's room with Van Helsing and Jonathan close behind him. He opens the door to the bedroom, and she was gone. And he looks out the window and sees her riding off on a horse. And Van Helsing says, She's going to warn Dracula. And the three men quickly run downstairs, and Jonathan says, Quick, we'll use my car to catch up with her. And they get into Jonathan's car. Jonathan starts up the car, and they quickly chased her down and intercepted her. Lucy then screams at the three men, saying, You don't understand him. He's just a lonely creature. He's such a great man. Jonathan says to Lucy angrily, You're wrong. He's a corrupted evil man. Then Van Helsing says to her, He has corrupted your soul, Lucy, and I'm here to stop him from doing it. The three men quickly run and pull Lucy off the horse as she was fighting them. Then Dr. Seward produces a syringe and injects her with a sedative. After she was out, Dr. Seward says to Jonathan and Van Helsing, You two go on to Carfax Abbey. I'm going to take her back home and lock her up. So Dr. Seward puts Lucy over the back of the horse. Then he gets on the horse and rides off back to the sanitarium. And Jonathan and Van Helsing then drive off to Carfax Abbey. Once the two men arrive to the Abbey, Jonathan Harker breaks in by entering through a window and opens the front door for Professor Van Helsing. The two men explore every room of the house and every floor of the house, but nothing. They finally go down to the basement. The basement is connected to an old series of crypts that once belonged to the old abbey. Dracula had sealed it off to make a wine cellar out of it, but Van Helsing was very suspicious whether the Count kept a secret door, and indeed his suspicion paid off as he found the secret door, and they entered the greater crypt. It was foul-smelling and dark, and armed with only a shovel and a lantern, the two men enter the crypt. Suddenly, Dracula appears out of thin air, frightening the two men, and he says, "Good afternoon, gentlemen. I see you found my hiding place." Van Helsing says, "Dracula, I should have known you'd be hiding down here with the cadavers and rats," he says to the Count. And Jonathan says, "You fiend, let my fiancée go from your power." Then Dracula says to Jonathan, "Oh no. Your fiancée," says Dracula to the young man, "is the most beautiful woman I've ever met. I've had many brides over the years," he says to him, and he goes on saying, "but I will make her my wife, and right now, as we speak, my blood is flowing through her veins, and she'll soon become a vampire like me, and then I shall elevate her above all," he says to Jonathan. Jonathan says, "I will stop you. She will not turn." Dracula says to Jonathan, "Oh, speak on, little man, speak on. But you forget, when you and Van Helsing are dust in the ground, I could call her back from the grave easily." Then Jonathan gets angry, lets out a shrill scream, and tries to swing the shovel at Dracula. But Dracula quickly turns into a bat, causing Jonathan to miss. And then Dracula in his bat form attacks Jonathan, biting him in the face. He screams for help to Professor Van Helsing. Van Helsing, trying to think what he could do to help, saw there was a giant wooden pillar that was holding up something on the ceiling, figuring that maybe it'll let sunlight in. Van Helsing grabs the shovel and with all his might hits the wooden pillar. Luckily, it was so rotted that it quickly breaks and causes the ceiling to cave in. And his theory was right. Light does flood into the crypt, causing the vampire in bat form to burst into flames and fly off hurriedly into the darkened corridors of the crypt. Van Helsing helps Jonathan back up. Jonathan thanks him, and then Van Helsing says to Jonathan that they had to get ready for tonight. He was going to definitely come for Lucy. Well, night had fallen, and Lucy was safe and sound locked up in her room with Nurse Hall sitting outside keeping guard and just looking around. And Dr. Seward had his groundskeeper and Martin armed with rifles and shotguns outside patrolling and making sure Dracula doesn't get in. Well, the three men were sitting in the parlor waiting for Dracula to make his move. It was a very nerve-wracking wait. It was only 10 o'clock at night. Meanwhile, in the sanatorium proper where all the mental patients were at, in his padded cell, Renfield was saying to himself, "Oh, I want a kitten so I could fatten it up and eat it. That's all I want this kitten for, but they won't let me have it. They won't let me have it." Then he hears something in his head, a voice talking in his head. It was Dracula talking to him telepathically, saying, "Renfield, listen to me. Do my bidding if you want to have eternal life. I will break you free, and you will have to stop Van Helsing and Dr. Seward and Jonathan Harker." Then Renfield's like, No, I won't do it. I won't kill. That's why I only eat insects. I just don't want to kill. I can't take a human life, Master. No, he says. Then Dracula says to him telepathically, "Renfield, do it, or I will torture you for an eternity." But Renfield refuses, angering Dracula. But Dracula had bigger fish to fry. Hours later, it was early in the morning, and Dracula exits the library. He walks quietly like a phantom through the house, going up the stairwell. As he goes up the stairwell, he makes his way to Lucy's bedroom entrance. There, Nurse Wells was still in her chair sitting down reading a book. She popped in a lot of pills to keep her awake all night. Then she was startled when she saw Dracula in front of her, but before she could let out a scream, Dracula hypnotized her and said, "You did not see me, you do not know what's going on, you will sleep now. Sleep." Then Nurse Wells falls asleep. Dracula opens the door and goes into Lucy's room and picks her up and walks off. Lucy was still sound asleep as he was walking down the spiraling staircase going down to the first floor. All of a sudden, he heard a voice scream at him, "Dracula!" Dracula stops in his path. He turns around to look at who screamed at him from behind. It was none other than Renfield. Renfield says, "Put the woman down, Dracula. It ends here tonight." Dracula puts down Lucy gently onto the ground, and he says to Van Helsing, "So, old fool, you're still awake. I keep forgetting that old people need so little sleep," said Dracula insultingly to Van Helsing. Van Helsing then says to Dracula, "No, I knew you were coming tonight, and I made it my priority to stay up. I will put an end to you tonight, you foul fiend." Then Dracula says, "Bring it on, old man, bring it on." Van Helsing pulls out a giant wooden cross and uses it against Dracula, fending him off. Then out of another room comes Jonathan Harker with cloves of garlic, and then from another room comes out Seward with another giant cross. They were holding off Dracula, and Jonathan says, "It's over for you tonight, you foul bastard." And Van Helsing says, "We have to hold him at bay until the sun rises and he'll be destroyed." Seeing himself surrounded, Dracula grabs his cape, wraps it around himself tightly, closes his eyes, and then suddenly he fades away like he had just teleported. Jonathan says, Where did he go? Dang it!" Then Van Helsing says, "He used his power to escape us. He had to get in here somehow." The men went their different directions to search. Then Jonathan and Van Helsing ran into each other at the entrance to the library, and there in the library they saw the escaped Renfield. He was going over one bookshelf. As he was looking around, Renfield had tripped a secret switch, and the bookshelf lifts up to reveal a secret passageway. Renfield then runs down the stairwell leading into the secret passage, and Van Helsing says to Jonathan in a whisper, "That's how he did it. That's how he got in here. It must connect to the old catacombs. We didn't know about it, but Dracula must have known about it." Then the two men decide to follow Renfield down the secret passage. As they run down the long, winding, spiral stone staircase to the crypt, the two men walk down the darkened corridors. The corridors were lit by torches, surely done so by Dracula. As they followed, they heard the scream of a man saying, "No, master, no, no!" They figured it was Renfield. They ran, and sure enough, they found Renfield, laid on his stomach, but his head was looking upwards. Dracula completely twisted his head around. They followed the lit passage until they found a area there. There was a giant stone sarcophagus and several crates of Romanian earth. Van Helsing says, "We found it. We found the fiend's sleeping area." Then he runs over to the giant stone sarcophagus and moves the giant slab. And there he was, inside, sound asleep Dracula. Then Van Helsing says to Jonathan Harker, "It is over, Jonathan. Go back upstairs and be with your fiancée. It ends here." Then Jonathan says, "But Van Helsing..." Van Helsing says, "No, Jonathan, do not argue with me. I will finish this myself. Please go back upstairs, seal the entrance, and I will take care of everything from here." Then Jonathan says, "Okay, Van Helsing, good luck and Godspeed, my friend." Van Helsing says, "You too, young man, you too." As Harker left, Van Helsing goes over to one of the empty crates of earth. Then he breaks a piece of wood that was sharp enough to pierce flesh. Looking around, Van Helsing finds an old torch holder on the ground. It was metal and it was strong enough to drive in the makeshift stake. Then he goes over to the sleeping Dracula, puts the makeshift stake over his heart, and begins hammering away, driving it into his chest. Of course, Dracula lets out a shrill scream. Oh! 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 After 437 years, it was over. Dracula, the king of vampires, was dead. And Van Helsing, he does a sign of the cross and walks away. Like and subscribe. The end.